In political discourse in the West today, we speak often of dignity, rights, and justice, but too often we detach these words from their source in the divine life. When we recall the heroes of social movements, too often we whitewash from the narrative their motivation. Why did the abolitionists fight to bring slavery to an end? Why did civil rights leaders care to see an equal and racially integrated society? And why should today's advocates for environmental conservation and better health care bother to work for any change at all? In all these cases and more, the real answer is God. He made us free. He loves his creation, and he desires us to see and experience the kingdom which has come near, a pledge of our ultimate hope of salvation. In every generation, Catholics have stood out as ambassadors for the kingdom. And in the modern era, we count Catholics among the heroes of the most transformative social movements. In their new book, Catholic Heroes of Civil and Human Rights, 1800s to the Present, Matthew Daniels and Roxanne King tell us about 16 such figures. From Pierre Toussaint to Franz Jägerstätter to St. Teresa of Calcutta, the Catholic Church of recent memory boasts of great exemplars of the virtues necessary for pursuing a humane present. These are men and women of perseverance and hope, people who know what true freedom and justice are, people whose consciences would not let them settle for an easy gospel or a comfortable life. These 16 stories are sure to inspire any Christian looking to live the fullness of the faith beyond the boundaries of private piety. Matthew Daniels is the Distinguished University Professor of Law, Political Science, and Human Rights at Anderson University in South Carolina. He is the founder of Good of All and the creator of the MLK Educational Initiative. He is the author of curricula and other resources published by Simon & Schuster, McGraw-Hill, and HarperCollins. I am pleased to welcome him to the Ignatius Press podcast now. Matthew Daniels, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Really glad to have the chance to talk to you today. We're discussing your book, Catholic Heroes of Civil and Human Rights, 1800 to the Present, which you have co-authored with Roxanne King. It's a great little book. It's a collection of biographical sketches of some figures who are maybe too little known, some Catholics of recent memory. What motivated you and your co-author to write this and put this out at this time?
Well, we're living in an era when we're facing a lot of dark forces in our world. And I think we need to encourage people of faith with the truth that we have the resources that we need to overcome those forces. And the best way to do that is to show them the stories and the lives of people who have overcome similar challenges in earlier eras.
You divide the book up into 5 categories to kind of tell the stories of these figures from different eras, mostly pretty recent times. And I thought that was a really clever way to kind of organize the lives of these interesting individuals, some of whom are canonized saints, most of whom are not or are not yet. But the first category that you focus on is the word freedom. And in the little introduction that you give to that section, you quote John Paul II's encyclical Veritatis Splendor, and you say, quoting JP2, "The follower of Christ knows that his vocation is to freedom." Now, freedom is one of those words that is perhaps somewhat misunderstood. Maybe the key issue with regard to freedom is, what is freedom for? And you focus in that section on a couple of people, at least, who I would think, anyway, in reading your accounts, have a very powerful testimony about what freedom is for, because they were born into slavery. So tell us about those figures that you focus on in that section.
Well, we have a number of figures in this book who have had to overcome almost unthinkable odds to achieve a life of service to those who are oppressed. So you have the first figure in the book who we profile, Pierre Toussaint. I mean, this is a man who was born a slave, who managed to earn his freedom. He could not change the structural system of slavery that was in place in his era. And so, working within that system, he dedicated himself to freeing others and is credited with having earned the freedom of a number of other slaves. He's also credited with numerous acts of charity. So, burdened by an institution that dehumanized him, that oppressed him, he was, in a sense, a Mother Teresa in his day. What impressed me working on this book, most people know the story of Mother Teresa, but there are really many Mother Teresas, some of them still amongst us. And, you can't argue with the life of a Mother Teresa. They are the best apologia for our faith that exists. And we need to share those stories in order to inspire other people. Another point that I just want to make up front is I think it's a big mistake for us to put saints up on a pedestal and treat them as if they're superheroes. Actually, they are ordinary people who had struggles and doubts and overcame all sorts of challenges. And actually, we're a lot like them, and we can do similar things if we are willing to avail ourselves of the same resources that they did, the power of God. And so I wanted these to be accessible, and I wanted these to be human portraits of that were accessible, and not somehow portraits of people who seem to be superhuman.
Yeah, I thought that came through in the stories in this section, that Pierre Toussaint, I mean, you think about what can you do for someone else? And I mean, he just worked hard and earned money and bought people's freedom, and among other things, right? I mean, in some respects, it was very unglamorous, and as you say, very much. Very much a Mother Teresa figure in certain respects, just sort of getting on with things and doing what he knew was right.
That's right. Within the context of the system of his time, he had he had a powerful redemptive effect for good. And if he can do that, we can. It's always humbling to me whenever I feel like I'm up against insurmountable barriers in my work. I just think of some of these profiles and some of these people, and it puts it in perspective pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think about that with my children sometimes. It becomes a little bit of a cliche, but when people start complaining about things around the house, you just wanna say, hey, let's stop for a minute and think about people who really suffered, and yet who fought through it and brought glory to God and helped other people, despite their circumstances.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, and that leads us to the second category, which is perseverance. I really enjoyed, again, the stories of the lives of the people that you talked about in this section. Father Augustus Tolton. One of the things that really struck me when you wrote about him was sometimes we feel like we have a calling, and it's a big important calling, and it's sort of out there somewhere, like we want to help people or we want to save the world, right? But then sometimes we're surprised that our calling ends up being right back at home, or right, or somewhere more immediate than we sort of dreamed it might be. Tell us about him.
Well, this is a man who, is the first, uh, pu- you know, colored priest, publicly known as Black in the United States, who had to overcome an amazing amount of racism and institutional resistance to fulfilling his own calling. He was someone of incredible spiritual gifts, by all accounts, had a life-changing impact on everyone around him. But I guess in a way he was sort of the Jackie Robinson of the priesthood, right? He had to break all the
Hmm.
color barriers, and that's not easy, And when you read his story, you realize, I mean, this wasn't that long ago, really, that some of these things occurred. Another figure in that section who's a favorite of mine is Diane Nash. Many people don't know that, she was Catholic. She was, of course, one of the Freedom Riders. She was instrumental in the Selma Voting Rights Act movement. It's a young woman who decided to put her life on the line. She was the Attorney General of the United States personally appealed to her not to go on the freedom rides because he was afraid she would not survive. And she wrote him back a message, a beautiful letter saying, "I've already written my will and testament and I'm prepared to die." And I mean, think about it. This is, a young girl who actually, had a bright future. She was a college student, and she was ready to lay it all down for what she believed. Yeah, another great example for all of us today.
Yeah, and it came through in her story to me that there's a certain kind of worldly prudence that isn't actually the same thing as the kind of radical call that is made upon us for the sake of the gospel. So the world would say to someone like Diane Nash, like, don't risk it, don't risk yourself. You have everything to live for, and this could ruin you. And she says, well, that I don't want what the world offers me. I want to serve God.
Yeah, very much like Dr. King. I mean, he knew he was going to die, and he was not going to live a life of fear. He lived a life of faith.
Yeah. Yeah, that really and the connection there, I admit I didn't know. I wasn't familiar with the name Diane Nash, but then when I was reading your account, I thought, oh yeah, I do remember that she's in these documentaries and in Eyes on the Prize and things like that, these sort of civil rights things. But then that she's Catholic was just a really interesting fact.
Well, I hope another theme that comes through in this book is that um, faith and conscience have always been integral to the civil rights enterprise. As you know, we live in an era when there are powerful secular forces that are seeking to sort of distort the history of civil rights in ways that weaponize rights language against people of faith and faith-based institutions. And in fact, when you look at history, and in fact, when you look at the present, you find over and over again, it's people of faith and faith-based institutions like the Catholic Church and Catholic Charities that are at the forefront of advancing human and civil rights because they believe in the dignity of all people made in the image of God. And whether it was the abolitionist movement or the movement, the civil rights movement, um, faith and conscience have always been integral to the civil rights enterprise. And Diane Nash is a great example of that. And it's no accident, in my opinion, that you don't hear anything about her faith in the secular media.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good transition to your third category, which is hope. And before talking about some of the figures in there, I just want to flag for our listeners and viewers that you introduce that section, that category, by mentioning Charles Péguy, who is, I think, a kind of underappreciated figure in modern Catholic and kind of intellectual life. He wrote a wonderful kind of long poem called "The Portal of the Mystery of Hope." And then you also mention Pope Benedict's great encyclical Spe Salvi, which is something that I point to over and over again as something that every Catholic, needs to kind of be familiar with when we're thinking about why it matters what we do anything in this world, right? I mean, we're not just like buying, you know, hell, insurance against hell, right? We're not just like trying to get to heaven without any regard to like what we're doing here and now. But in fact, what we're doing here and now is important because of our ultimate hope, right?
Yeah, it's easy to be discouraged when you look at some of these forces in our world today, and it's important to not underestimate the power of one life that's really committed to the Lord, because when you walk in faith, in alignment with the will of God, you have the resources of heaven at your disposal. Um, Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's there. And so you can have a world changing impact beyond what would be possible simply as a human being. And that's part of the journey of faith, right? And these stories are illustrations of that. I mean, these are people who had an extraordinary impact by the virtue of the power of God in their lives.
Yeah, let's talk about a couple of those figures. Julia Greeley, she was someone I had never heard of before, but she's another figure who was born into slavery. And tell us a little more about her, how she became Catholic and what she ended up meaning to the Catholic community that she belonged to.
Well, this is a sort of Harriet Tubman type of figure. This is somebody who um, lived a life that is unbelievably courageous and beautiful. Uh, this woman, as a child, lost her eye to a slave master's whip. She made her way to Denver and became known as Denver's Angel of Charity. So she was a sort of Mother Teresa of Denver in her day. She was at the forefront of caring for children and orphans. She was at the forefront of caring for the needs of the community. And it's no small thing that she's the only person buried in the Denver Basilica. The only layperson is this African American woman who rose from slavery to be a really, as I said, a Mother Teresa in her time.
Yeah, and to this day, I think there are people in the Catholic community in Denver who sort of remember her or have heard of her. She's sort of a figure that really has lasted in the memory there.
Yes, that's right. That's right. People speak of her in very endearing terms because her story is still known in Denver.
Yeah, I'm glad for more people to know her story thanks to your book. A figure that maybe the most interesting figure to me in your entire book was Nicholas Black Elk. And somebody I'd never heard of before. He was at Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee, and later becomes a Catholic. What do we have to learn from him?
Well, yeah, this is a guy who, again, steps right out of the pages of a history book. Um, he is, in a sense, the kind of Native American St. Paul, right? He, uh, as you said, was present at Little Bighorn. He, I believe, had he had family who were some of the most famous tribal leaders of the day. And he came to Christ and decided to take the gospel to the Native American community. And one of the vehicles that he used for that was, of course, they have the concept of a healer in the Native American tradition. And so he sort of positioned himself, if you will, as a spiritual healer and offered, the healing message of the gospel. And so, yeah, again, everyone should know this man's name. There should be a movie about him. And yet, most people don't. That I have to say, that's the most amazing part of this work for me was discovering people who really should be household names and we've never heard of them.
And one thing I'd love to just note in passing about him that relates to a lot of the figures that you talk about in the book is that he was a layman, and I think that it's really wonderful to know the stories of brave priests and monks and bishops and that sort of thing, but to really focus on people who had no holy orders, but who just went out and did the gospel work and proclaimed, and that's what this man did.
Yeah, and that's how the work of the kingdom gets done. I mean, there's only a small number of people in the religious vocations. So if they're the ones, you can't uh, you can't just look to the religious orders to do the work of the kingdom. The kingdom is everybody's business, right?
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't a professional churchman, and sometimes we wanted to stand back and say, "Well, let's let the professionals do the work." But really, it's people like Nicholas Black Elk who are the most effective, probably. Yeah,
Yeah, and actually, I think there, the testimony of a life like that, in some ways, is even more powerful because other people look at you and they, I mean, they see you as someone who they can identify with, right? When you're a priest or a nun, you're sort of in another category. But here's your neighbor, here's your friend, here's your coworker.
yeah, and maybe one last point about Nicholas Black Elk. I'm sorry, I can't get off him, but you mentioned before, he used the concepts that were native to his people. And I wonder if there are a lot more opportunities than are currently being explored among different groups of people to, to kind of speak to the truth of the gospel through the reality that people are accustomed to, like we see there with the Native American community with Nicholas Blackout.
Well, I, personally, I think we have to do that, or we won't be heard. In my case, I spent a lot of time trying to reach a new generation with the transcendent principles enshrined in Dr. King's teachings for exactly that reason, because it's his name and his history are sufficiently well known that they open a door. And then, of course, the world has worked hard to help us forget that his whole life was rooted in his faith. The substance and the tactics that he chose were rooted in his faith. He, just like Diane Nash.
Yeah. Yeah, and conjuring Dr. King's name is a good transition to our next category, which is justice. Now, I was really glad that you pointed out how social justice. Now that's a Catholic term, I think, originally a Catholic term, and it's one that has taken on a really quite a different life, I think, in the purely secular world.
Well, I think that's an understatement. I think it's been hijacked and weaponized.
Yeah, yeah. Say more about that. How do you see that?
Well, if you don't have some concept of people made in the image of God and some concept or notion of the reality of the dignity of the human person, then the entire human rights enterprise is really just a fallacy. You really have nothing to say to the forces that want to treat people as objects. So it's no accident that throughout history, people of faith have been at the forefront of advancing civil and human rights. It's no accident that Catholics have been at the forefront of that enterprise. But the world has secular forces that want to sort of seize the mantle and the language and the narrative of rights, have worked hard to create a rights narrative that is hostile to faith and to faith-based institutions. And that's really very dark if you think about it. It's taking something that originates in faith and in a faith-based view of reality, and then distorting it into a weapon to be used against people of faith. And that really speaks to the intelligence of evil, actually.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective very much. You say love, not activism, breeds authentic social justice. I thought that was a really striking thing to say, because, of course, a lot of the people in the book are, I think, by rights activists in a very real sense, but it's grounded in love, in real love, Christian charity. Not, C.S. Lewis once said, oftentimes when people say God is love, what they really mean is love is God, right? They sort of want to define love on their own terms rather than understanding it as God, as the life of God.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to the example of Dr. King for a moment, and Diane Nash. Um, you know, uh, these are people who risked their lives, and in the case of Dr. King, lost his life for a view of activism that would not countenance violence, right? A very courageous and principled view that it was immoral to engage in violence, even against people who were trying to kill you, because they were made in the image of God. And interestingly, all the social science research for the past half century has proven that Dr. King and Diane Nash were right, and figures like Malcolm X were wrong. Violence is good for intimidating, but nonviolence alone has the power to persuade. And that's how you achieve enduring progress in a democratic society. You have to win hearts and minds. So, when they walked across Edmund Pettus Bridge, and when they faced the fire hoses and the police dogs, and they didn't respond with violence to the horrific violence being meted out against them, they called the conscience of America to account. And that's really how and why they succeeded.
Yeah, and it seems to me that Saint Oscar Romero stands for much the same thing. Tell us a little bit about him and his witness.
Well, this is a man who went up against the horrific violence in his home country in Latin America, um, during an era when there was incredible carnage through a civil war and so on. And, he called upon members of the military to not um, contribute to the endless cycle of violence. He was a champion of the poor and the oppressed. He was attacked and criticized by the government. And, he was ultimately killed for being, in a sense, a voice like Dr. King, speaking against violence and speaking for the poor and the oppressed. And he was actually shot while performing Mass. So this is a true martyr.
Yeah, and I mean, what a thing. I sometimes wonder now. There are cases, for example, in Europe. There's the case of Jacques Hamel, and people like that who are sort of, you know, priests, type figures who become martyrs. But sometimes I worry that the world is almost too indifferent to what the church has to do. That someone like Oscar Romero would just be sort of ignored now, rather than thought to be a threat.
Well, I think that we must remember that it's not just us speaking when we stand up for these principles that are rooted in the heart and mind of God, right? And so we're actually more dangerous than we realize
Yeah.
when we confront the schemes and logic of darkness with the truth. And one of the things that I'm noticing around the world is the incredible vitriol being directed by regimes against ordinary people who are bloggers, who are writing on social media, calling out certain injustices. Um, in a way, because of the advent of digital media, ordinary people have an incredible power today to be a voice that was not possible in Dr. King's day, for example. So, like I said, the world regards us as dangerous, and we'll come after you, if you really are effective in being a voice for the light. And that's sort of part of the, I don't know. I tell people I want to be on the all growth, no suffering plan, but I can't find it.
Hmm. That's right.
And, I think the Catholic Church has always had a fairly good theology of suffering. This is part of the call of following Christ, right? And and in that, our faith grows.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about Catherine Drexel for a moment.
Yeah, I
She,
love Catherine Drexel because she, to me, is like the American Saint Francis of Assisi, right? This is a woman born to great wealth, a family that was one of the wealthiest families of her era, and she um, gave it all away. She had a call to help the most poor and oppressed groups in the United States, African Americans and Native Americans, and devoted her life to that call. She happened to be a very savvy woman with a lot of business sense. And so the things that she built have had enduring impact, the schools, the charities, and so on. One of the endorsers of our book is Father Maurice Sands, the head of the Office of Black and Indian Missions in Washington, D.C., which was founded by Catherine Drexel. And the building that she built is still standing in Washington, D.C., where I've been a number of times. She built the building because she knew that if you cared about Native Americans, you had to have a voice in Congress because Congress runs the Indian reservations. So she's a very smart woman. Yeah, she's a St. Francis of Assisi whose name needs to be better known to Americans.
yeah, and it strikes me in this day and age, it's easy to maybe get annoyed by the use of, someone might talk about a person's privilege, for example, and we might step back and say, well, come on, look, how privileged am I really? Like it ends up becoming sort of a way to sort of shame a person, or to kind of, it becomes it belongs, as you said before about social justice, it sort of becomes hijacked by some kind of like secular agenda. But in fact, there are these great exemplars in the history of the church that do show us that there is something to this idea that, like, that to those, for those to whom much is given, much is owed.
Yeah,
And
well, I
you,
think this
yeah.
this is a woman who very clearly realized something that many people miss, and that is it's God's money. And she spent it like it was God's money. And she'll be honored forever for that. And it's a profound delusion to forget that it's God's money.
Yeah, and I really hope maybe people with money will especially read that chapter that you've written about Catherine Drexel, and maybe, feel a little convicted about how they could maybe put it to use, whether they give it all up and join a religious community or not, right?
Amen.
Yeah. Conscience. Okay, I really, conscience is something I think about a lot. I'm a big devotee of John Henry Newman, and so to me, he was so on to understanding his times, but also prophetic about our times in talking about how conscience was the aboriginal vicar of Christ, and how, even though, of course, we're sort of, we understand the way the church works and the Pope and the hierarchy and all that sort of thing, there is still, something in us, in each one of us, that is this sort of arbiter of right or wrong, that is a gift from God. And you talk about a number of people in this chapter, um, who who embody that, who pursued conscience, in the face of opposition. So tell us about conscience a little bit.
Well, this we included this very deliberately because um, whether it's Dr. King, Diane Nash, or some of the martyrs like Franz Jägerstätter, who we profile in the book, um, conscience has always driven people of faith in the face of oppressive systems, um, and it's for reasons that we talked about earlier. Being increasingly challenged by secular forces in our era, right? The idea is there's a higher law than the laws of man. And so often one needs to disobey the laws of man to serve the higher law. And there are many flashpoints and issues where this can occur in the case of Franz Jagerstatter. It was his refusal to obey Hitler, an ordinary man who just simply would not serve in the German military and who was beheaded for following his conscience. Um, I like the profile of Dorothy Day a great deal, and I've always liked her a great deal because she struggled mightily with issues that are very much in play today. Are we going to solve the problems of the world through ideologies of man or through the power of God? This is a woman who, like many in her era who were, intellectuals, was tempted by Marxist ideology. This was a time when it was easier to be tempted by that ideology because its true nature and historical track record had not been fully revealed. But she ultimately chose to serve as a Catholic and to serve in accordance with her Catholic faith because she realized that at the end of the day, the real power to overcome evil and to help the poor was going to be found in God, not man. So this woman's story is a beautiful portrait of someone who chose the right path.
Yeah, and I want to talk about Franz Jägerstätter in a second, but let's first on Dorothy Day. The thing to me that's interesting about her, she has the famous quip about everyone wants to change the world, but no one wants to do the dishes or something like that. And it seems to me that she's just one of these figures who is applicable to anyone's life now. You don't have to live in kind of momentous times like Jägerstätter did to just choose to see the reality that is around you and to make a choice that is formed by a Christian conscience.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and this, I mean, this is a woman whose heart broke, really just broke with compassion for the poor. And the Catholic worker movement that she started has been an enduring force for good. Um, so that's one of the legacies of her life. She built communities and networks around her, calling to help the poor. And, again, is a sort of American Mother Teresa in a way, just an angel of mercy to the poor.
Yeah.
She did her work through writing and through publishing, but it's the same voice.
Yeah. And something that I have found interesting about devotees of Dorothy Day is I know that, they're sort of, I think kind of left-wing secular people tend to like Dorothy Day in some regard. But the people that I know, the faithful Catholic people that I know who are most devoted to Dorothy Day are people who are just like who just truly want to pursue the path of the gospel. I mean, these are people who are like radically pro-life, for example. And in just like they try to check every box. And I admit, I have trouble checking all all the boxes, and their witness to me because of Dorothy Day is convicting.
Yeah, amen, amen.
Yeah, Franz Jägerstätter is a figure that I admire very much. In some ways, I I don't know how else to put it except like this. In some ways, I find myself almost envying him for the times in which he lived. Here's why I say that. Because living our day-to-day mundane lives, it can be so difficult to choose that kind of heroic path, right? Like to say this and not that, right? We just kind of go along, go with the flow. We're comfortable. We're never really presented with these kinds of monumental choices that are before us. Franz Jägerstätter, though, was. He just tried to live an ordinary life, and he was asked to swear this oath, and it was black and white, yes or no, will you do it? And he said, no, I can't do it because of my faith, and it cost him his life. Now, again, I don't want to be too blithe about it, but in some respects, it's wow to have it be so black and white. Um, it is kind of an amazing thing that some people at some times in history get get to or have to live through.
Yeah, well, I think that sort of moment is going to be increasingly common in everyone's life, given the culture that we're living in today. And so it's important that we do lift up his example. It's also important for us to remember that, Hitler and the Nazi movement probably would not have been as successful as they were had more German Catholics and Lutherans had the courage and conviction of a Franz Jägerstätter. You see, if there had been 10,000 Franz Jägerstätters, it might have stopped the course of the Nazi regime in its infancy, before Hitler became unstoppable. And so his example is very important. It's sort of like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Um, Unfortunately, he was the exception, not the rule. And that's why we're lifting him up.
Yeah, this is something, by the way, which comes through so clearly in Terrence Malick's great film about Jägerstätter called A Hidden Life. The churchmen depicted in that movie are just paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They're the parish priest, Jägerstetter's parish priest, just kind of counsels him to, he basically says, look, no one will even know what you're going to do. No, all that will happen is you will die and your wife will be a widow and your children will grow up without a father. And that, I mean, that is a pretty compelling case, I think, against choosing the radical path. And yet Jägerstätter just won't relent. But then there's this other scene in that movie where he's standing in his parish church with this man who's painting on the walls, painting images of Christ. And the man says, I can't paint the real Christ. Like basically these people just don't want to see him. And Jägerstätter is standing there in a sense like as that figure, as this person that the rest of the town, the rest of the world doesn't want to see, the person who's really going to take the gospel seriously.
Yep. Yeah, he's again one of these ordinary people who is extraordinary because he availed himself of the power of God. And the Spirit was working mightily in him. He was guided by dreams, making it clear to him, what path to follow.
Yeah.
But those resources are available to all of us. And as I said earlier, we're going to increasingly find ourselves in challenging situations in this culture. So these examples are going to be very relevant.
Yeah, it's almost like we're just kind of frogs in the water right now, kind of coming, slowly boiling. But there does seem to be something in the air that there may be moments coming when Christians are going to have to stand up for their faith.
Yeah, I think we're living in a 1920s moment personally right now. I think the world democracy around the world is very fragile. It's been shaken to the core by the pandemic. Democracies require some measure of public trust, and public trust in democracy is at an all-time low. So, yeah, we're in a very fragile sort of Weimar Republic moment.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective on it. What about Sister Thea Bowman? I admit I didn't really know much about her.
Well, this is another woman who was a voice for the poor and the oppressed. She was a pioneer in terms of, religious orders for women of color. She was a voice for racial reconciliation. She was a champion of education. Again, an ordinary person, very humble person, actually. She's almost self-effacing, who touched thousands of lives by virtue of her witness. And uh, on her tombstone, the inscription reads, "I tried." That's the humble words of a true saint, right?
Yeah, and that really, I think, is something that characterizes all of the people that you describe in the book. That I tried. Um, I find that inspiring. Give it a go. You're not going to be perfect. You're never going to be perfect, but there's no harm in looking at someone who sets an example and striving for it.
Yeah, and God will meet you. I mean, that's the thing. This is part of the faith journey. It's the loaves and fishes, right? Yeah, you don't have enough to feed the masses, but God will meet you.
Yeah.
I once met Mother Angelica, and who I really enjoyed talking to immensely. And she said, "I'm God's dodo." You know what a dodo is? A dodo is a bird so dumb it doesn't know it can't fly.
Yeah.
Man, she said, "We need more dodos." And I mean, really, right? The whole enterprise of going up against the world in faith, right, with insufficient resources, is, from the perspective of the world, a foolish enterprise, but it is the one that we're called to because it's the way in which the power of God is manifested in human lives.
Yeah, and sometimes maybe we over plan, we over analyze, we want strategies for everything, and all of the people in this book just did it. They just, it's like that G.K. Chesterton talked about Saint Joan of Arc in that way. That she wasn't paralyzed at a crossroads. She just bolted forward, and that's, it seems to me, what so many of the great saints in history show us, that we don't want to be reckless for the wrong reasons, but in some respects, God does use our recklessness to His glory.
Amen. Amen. That's right. Yeah. And I mean, think about the first century church, think about the early civil rights movement. Think about the abolitionist movement. The equation has always been one where God's people are outgunned and outnumbered, but he wants it that way, apparently, because that's how his glory is revealed.
Yeah. As we wrap up, I one of the things I really liked about your book at the end was the bibliography that you provided, because you give us these snippets, these kind of tidbits of story, and they're really sufficient, I think, for the most part, for people to just kind of dip in, find out about this person, find out about that person. But I was struck by, there are one or two or three figures in the book that I thought I probably would like to know a lot more about that person, and so you provide that bibliography. What went into that?
Well, that's exactly why we put it there. We want people to be able to do the deeper dive. I mean, we're hoping that, some of these stories will inspire people and that they're going to want to be led to learn more. And we want to fuel that fire, right? Um, the lives in this book, each one of them, is a treasure trove of the grace of God at work in a human spirit. And so it's a great place to go for inspiration for your own life in the times in which we're living.
Yeah. And one final thing that struck me was a number of the figures in this book are either servants of God or venerable. They're on the road, I guess, to canonization, but you never know. These things stall out, and sometimes people just sort of get forgotten. And I wonder if your hope is maybe partly that people will remember these figures and in this process.
Well, yeah, the larger enterprise is we have to know our own history, right? If you forget your own history, you lose your identity. And one of the things that has never ceased to amaze me is how the history of the civil rights movement and of the human rights enterprise in the West has essentially been rewritten by secular forces that sometimes deliberately, but often through sheer blindness, just ignore the role of faith, and behind that, the power of God in this larger work. And knowing that story is essential for God's people to be effective today.
Yeah, amen to that. The book is called Catholic Heroes of Civil and Human Rights. The authors are Matthew Daniels, with whom I've been speaking today, and Roxanne King. The book is now available from Ignatius Press, wherever you get your books. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
You're welcome.